one of our favorite guests, period, regardless of any of the sports that we talk about, from ESPN, one of the best NBA insiders in the game, Brian Windhorst, back on the show. How are you, Brian?
I'm okay, Rich. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for joining. Let's jump in with both feet here about James Harden and your colleague Tim McMahon's story. Obviously it's somebody else who wrote it. Did anything that come out of that story leap out at you, surprise you, or something? This is industry known. What's been going on with Houston and Harden, Brian?
Well, Tim McMahon is a Bulldog reporter who is completely fearless. So he reports these types of stories all the time. Although this one is pretty special.
Right.
It's not unusual. Star treatment in the NBA. Especially over the last decade, for star players to dictate practice schedules, to dictate travel schedules. I mean, I remember when I first started covering the NBA, teams flew out after every game. If they were on the road, they traveled after every night. They didn't care if it was January in Los Angeles and your next stop was Salt Lake City, you traveled. And that is no longer the norm. And star players have driven that. LeBron, back in his first go-around in Cleveland, was getting changes in travel schedules. That is not unusual. There's certain star treatment that has certainly been paid to Kawhi Leonard by the LA Clippers. So those stories really aren't surprising. I think what Tim is pointing out is that, the Rockets really were not just giving James those special privileges, but really letting him dictate over major decisions that happened in the roster. And, sometimes, look, LeBron James wanted Anthony Davis. He pretty much was willing to, he made it pretty clear, it's willing to trade the whole team for Anthony Davis, which they did. And it turned out pretty good. It's not unique to Harden, but it hasn't worked out for Harden. While he has been spectacular over the last 6 or 7 years, he hasn't delivered at the highest level in the playoffs. And now the Rockets' situation is very badly eroded, and Harden is a root cause. And you have to assess the collateral damage from that. And it makes for a complicated situation. And more importantly, Rich, if you're out there and you want to trade for James Harden, you are seeing this story. You probably had a pretty good idea of this anyway.
Right.
But you are seeing this story. You are learning about this. You are looking at a guy who is not dedicated to his conditioning. You're looking at a guy who turned down a $100 million extension and then didn't dedicate to his conditioning, who is putting his teammates and his coach in a horrible position. And he's basically saying, okay, come trade for me. It's pushing the limits of the star power of NBA pretty much to its nth degree.
Now you alluded to this, and it's just like in the NFL too. There really are no secrets. The chattiest bunch of people I've ever met is anybody involved in a sports organization. Everybody talks to each other. I'm sure most of this stuff was already known, although perhaps what Chris Paul and Harden were grinding gears about, or Russell Westbrook in a film room in the bubble, as Tim McMahon was talking about, chafing over Harden time, I guess, and he wasn't there in time for a film session and demanding it start, and D'Antoni saying if we started, we'll just start it again when James arrives, and so on and so forth. Those details might be first brought to light by this remarkable story by your colleague Tim McMahon, but putting it all together, the thing that I took out of it is, like, would you, even knowing all this, go ahead and trade for a guy for whom his regimen would absolutely catch up with mid-30s, right? I mean, like, at some point there has to be a little bit of slowing of the in between games frolic, right? I mean, wouldn't that be a concern for any team that might take on Harden here?
Yeah, especially because he's in a strange sort of tweener position with his contract. Now, we all remember a couple of years ago when Kawhi Leonard demanded a trade. He had 1 year left on his contract. The Spurs had next to no leverage, and the trade package that they got, they got a quality player in DeMar DeRozan, but it wasn't the same, trade that you could have made if you were going to have him for a few years. So the Rockets are not taking pennies on the dollar for him because he's got multiple years. Having said that, it's 2 years. So if you're going to pay the going rate for an MVP level player, which is probably all the good young players you've got on your roster, maybe your best player, depending on how the trade works, and potentially 2 or 3 first-round draft picks. If you're trading, you're mortgaging your future. Can you do that with a guy with 2 years left on his contract? Ideally, you'd like for him to extend his contract so that you have a window with him. So he's in that sort of zone. But you look at him and you look at the way he's treated his team, and now you have pause. He does have a player option in his contract. You could sort of split the difference and ask him to pick up that player option. But, a contract extension for him would be paying him $50 million a year when he's in his mid-30s. That's a hard pill to accept right now. And so the Rockets have a high burden that they wanted to get him in a trade, which understandably he's been in the top 3 or 4 of the MVP race for the last half decade. And then you have teams that are going to be worried about that. I think it's a very complicated trade to pull off. I think they'll get it done.
You do?
But I think it's going to be a hard mix.
You do? You think they – so when does something like this get done?
That's the question we don't know. I mean, I think, one of the things that's happened in the last few months, Rich, is that the 2021 free agent class, which at one time looked pretty damn promising, has essentially vaporized. Giannis will not be a part of it. There was I'm not saying that I thought LeBron or Anthony Davis were going to move, but there was a possibility that those guys were going to be free agents. They ended up both signing long. Paul George was going to potentially be available. He extended his contract. And even sort of the second level star players, Drew Holiday is likely to extend in Milwaukee now that Giannis has. Rudy Gobert, who's an attractive player, an extension candidate. The only guy out there of an elite level, super elite level free agent is going to be Kawhi. He's not eligible for an extension, so he's going to be a free agent. Having said that, there's no indication he's leaving L.A. So if you're a team that was pinning itself on trying to get a star player in 2021, you reassess here and say, well, the star player we may be able to get is James Harden. So and I do think there's 2 or 3 teams out there who could get into that game. Whether or not those teams are going to be on James Harden's list, and whether or not James Harden, if he got traded to a place off of his list, would show up and play like Kawhi Leonard showed up and played, that's an open question for sure.
All right. So, Brian Windhorst, who are those teams? Are any of the? Let's start with this. Are any of the teams that are on Harden's wish list a possibility? Do you think?
I think the Miami Heat are an interesting possibility. Pat Riley has long been a guy who's believed in get me the highest level talent, and then our system will make it work. The classic example of that was Shaquille O'Neal when he had kind of washed out his welcome in L.A., and they got him into a position where he was executing at a very high level. And they have the young players. The problem with that is they only have one draft pick they're currently allowed to trade, which is 2027. So it's hard for them to give the draft capital. But, a young player like Tyler Hero being a centerpiece of a trade package might be interesting. You have the New York Knicks, who have, a bunch of young players, all of their draft picks available to them. And if they want to improve rapidly, that's a guy that they could maybe get. And then you have some sort of for farther shot teams, which would be maybe a team like the Cleveland Cavaliers, who has young players, has extra draft picks. I don't think that's where James Harden would want to be, but that's the type of team that could maybe make an offer that could get Houston interested. And you could go farther down the list. But I do think that there will be teams that will make offers. When will they make them? We have to see how things play out.
Brian Windhorst here on the Rich Eisen Show. When we had you on during the summer and we were all looking over the steering wheel at the Giannis decision while the bubble was wrapping up, you said that if Giannis doesn't sign for the supermax, the NBA might as well just remove that whole construct from the collective bargaining agreement, that it was created exactly for a player like this in a franchise like Milwaukee. He is now signed. So I'm assuming 2 things that I'd love to give you the floor on. 1, the NBA is breathing a sigh of relief. And 2, there are a bunch of teams that were hoping for Giannis to leave that are now on to plan B's long term. I'll give you the floor on who those teams are and what the NBA is thinking right now.
I know that this sounds sort of like a little bit of a crazy statement, but Giannis signed that contract yesterday. You could make the case it's the biggest moment in the Bucks franchise since 1974 when Kareem Abdul-Jabbar had beef Wellington and then looked up at Wayne Embry, the general manager, and said, hey, I want you to trade me. He had won a title there. He had just lost Game 7 of the finals and was the reigning MVP. They traded him to the Lakers some months later. The Bucks have not been back to the finals since. And for a small market team with an NBA superstar, there's no more fragile relationship. Giannis leaving the Milwaukee Bucks potentially sets them back a decade or more, 2 decades or 4 decades. You just don't get players like this. And so for Giannis to make this commitment to give them a gift, and then one of the reasons it's a gift is not just because he's staying with them, but Rich, he could have signed this exact same contract next summer. By doing it now and giving up his options in free agency, he removes an incredible amount of stress that was going to be on the Bucks this season, and it does give the Bucks the best chance to be successful this year. But he gave away something to it. He gave away his optionality. This is just not something we see in the modern NBA. We just haven't seen players do this. The supermax has worked in a couple of occasions, specifically for Damian Lillard. That captured him in Portland. He stayed. It did not work for Kawhi Leonard. It did not work for Anthony Davis. And so had this been the third one in a row where it didn't work, I do think it was going to be in peril. Now, if you watch the way teams operated in the offseason, you could definitely clearly see teams hedging. The Dallas Mavericks made moves to make sure that they could have cap space to sign Giannis. The Miami Heat signed a bunch of players to 1-year contracts so that they could open up space. The Toronto Raptors gave this contract to Fred VanVleet that looked like a valley and mountain. It started off high, and the next year dips down to allow for more cap space to sign Giannis, and then goes back up. The New York Knicks didn't spend their money to make sure that they had a spot open for him. So now those teams do have to move on. It was kind of like a poker game. They had all sort of put their chips in the center to ante. Now they're going to have to look at their other options. And like I said, maybe it includes James Harden. Maybe they wait and see what happens with Bradley Beal, who is sort of the next star player teams are keeping an eye on. Maybe you go down and look farther down the list, but certainly Giannis committing was not seen as good news for a lot of teams, especially in those types of markets in the last 24 hours.
And since we haven't seen something like this, as you said, in the modern NBA, I'm assuming we should also, assuming that we should also not expect Giannis to force his way out because he doesn't like what's happening so early on in his contract, right? Like we shouldn't expect that. Well,
that's a reality that exists. You know, just like in the entertainment business, and we're seeing it with Harden. We've seen it over and over. A contract is over when the talent says it's over.
Nice.
Now there is a 1 year. It's built into the supermax. You can't trade a player for 1 year. So the Bucks are safe for this year. You're not allowed to trade them until next season. They are certainly not out of the pressure cooker. You know, if they don't continue to spend, and one of the things that they had to make clear to Giannis is, look, we're going to spend into the luxury tax, and it's going to be an expensive team because keeping Drew Holiday is probably going to cost them in the neighborhood of $30 million a year for a supporting player. They're already playing Chris Middleton $30 million a year, so they're going to be a very expensive team. But they definitely need to do that. But one of the reasons why this was such an incredible thing for them is even if Giannis comes to them in 2 years and is not happy with the way they're going and expresses an interest in leaving, he will be on a long-term contract, and they will be able to get a king's reward for them. And, they will not get a player like Giannis in all likelihood, but they will be able to protect their franchise. If he walks away next summer, you have a nuclear wasteland. So, nobody wants to talk about that in Milwaukee right now, and they shouldn't be talking about that, but that was definitely part of the calculus when they talked about this deal.
Well, and again, I before I let you go here, Brian, this has just been great to just get lost in all of the contractual drama and free agency drama and, James Harden and so on and so forth. I'm just thankful for Harden. He didn't apparently pick up COVID, partying in Vegas, and I'm sure the NBA is not terribly thrilled to see, one of their bold-faced name players on Instagram basically flouting everything like that on the advance of a season where there's no bubble. So what is the plan here for the NBA on actually to go through a season where they're a contact sport indoors? I mean, this is unprecedented what we're about to see, at least with the NFL and college football. They're outdoors. We're already getting a glimpse of how odd it looks with college basketball. How is the NBA approaching this, Brian?
Well, let me give you the official answer, and then I'll give you sort of the reality answer.
Okay.
The official answer is that the NBA believes that it has very robust testing, way better testing than the NFL. It's easier because it's a smaller group, and they think that that they will be able, through testing, to protect. Now, the schedule is kind of preposterous to me because they are still committed to playing 30 interconference games, which means teams starting in January are going to be going on 6-game road trips in and out of 6 hotels, on and off their planes 6 times in 6 different cities. I mean, I don't see. But, here's a realistic answer. There's probably going to be some discontinuing because the most important thing for the NBA was really to get started Christmas week. And even if they have some disruption in January or February before the vaccine can potentially arrive for NBA players, whenever that may be, whether that's February or March, we don't know. The back half of their season, the vaccine they're hoping is going to save it. Getting that start on Christmas week is extraordinarily important financially. That's why they forced it. Here's the other thing that nobody will talk about. The NBA has already announced over 100 players have tested positive for COVID, both in the restart last summer and in the start this year. In talking to agents and talking to trainers and talking to people with teams, that number could actually be 2 or 3 times higher in actuality. So many more players have had this and recovered from it and have some level of antibodies. There may already be a partial way to herd immunity in the league. Some people have said they think it's 40% or so.
Wow.
Now, I'm going to be very, very careful with the next thing that I say.
Sure.
Okay? Some players who have already had the virus may be operating with a level of freedom that surprises people, but because they've had the virus, they know that they're not as much in danger, and it may be surprising what is seen on social media. Okay? And that's why the NBA is going to be tested here, because they have put down these laws and said no nightclubs, no restaurants that are not on our list, etc. But yet here we have James Harden, who we've just talked about how the Rockets get away with all this stuff. Here's James Harden, obviously in nightclubs. Here's James Harden, obviously not doing his media. Kyrie Irving got a lot of attention. James Harden has not spoken to the press yet. There was a game last night. He still hasn't spoken to the press. He's in flagrant violation of the NBA's media rules. He has not been fined for that yet. There's been no fine sent down whatsoever. Doesn't mean he won't be at some point. But they put out the new rules that you're not allowed to go in nightclubs, and the next 2 nights James Harden's in nightclubs. That is going to be a challenge for the NBA. For the players who have the antibodies, what sort of example are they going to set for their teammates and publicly as that goes forward?
And I hope that they're right, that having had it before does actually prevent you from getting it again, because the one thing we know about this virus is you think you know one thing about it, then you read something completely counter, and it's very confusing. And I just hope that there's, in fact, that light at the end of the tunnel. Brian, you always make me smarter. I love our chats. Thanks for the time. Greatly appreciate it. Let's chat down the line. You got it. Thank you. That's Brian Windhorst at Windhorst ESPN on both Twitter and Instagram. I truly love I say it every time. I'm like a broken record when he's on. He truly makes me smarter. He knows what he's talking about. He knows what he's talking about. Hey, you watched all the way to the end. Thanks for that. Watch more right here.